Thanks, Robin. Drugs. It's a strong word, right? Who's on drugs here today? Yeah, nice. There's a few hands raised. But it's a word that's kind of loaded with stigma and emotion, right? For most of us, our first introduction to the concept of drugs will have been education at school, where we're told, just say no, stay away from drugs, drugs are bad. Or the media, the media loves to report on drugs in a negative way. It sells newspapers, it gets clicks, it gets engagements, even films generally portray drugs in a negative way. And so, because of that, when we say the word drugs, something in our brain lights up of either fear, danger, or for those of us who ignored the education, we still associate drugs with doing something wrong, breaking the law, breaking the rules. The fact of the matter is, I would say 95% of people in this room are on drugs. I can see some pretty tasty looking Bloody Marys and beers. I've had a couple of the beers, they're pretty nice. Coffee, some of you have gone outside for a vape, and some of you maybe even for a cig, although it's a bit of a dying art now. And nicotine, caffeine, alcohol, they're no more or less drugs than ecstasy, than cocaine, than cannabis. And we humans, we love taking drugs, and we always have. There is a theory, and this one's hotly contested, so don't hold me to it, but Terence McKenna was a psychedelic evangelist, and he proposed that humans exist because of drugs. The idea was that our ancient ancestors, Homo erectus, would graze on mushrooms that contain psilocybin. And that led to a huge cognitive leap in human development. It gave us language, it gave us community, it gave us art. Now, it's widely contested, and we have no proof of that, but we do have proof of drug use going back at least 10,000 years. So, cannabis was first cultivated in Asia in 8,000 BC. That's the Neolithic period. We have evidence in America, the Americas, of mescaline use, tobacco use, nicotine, and even cocaine in the form of coca leaves. That goes back around 6,000 BC. Humans discovered alcohol around 7,000 BC, and then again independently. This wasn't communicated knowledge, it was humans just discovering a way to get pissed. And we've always sought out ways to alter our consciousness. It's an integral part of being human. And this desire to do so has formed some of the civilizations that came before us that sort of laid the groundwork for the civilization we know today. The Egyptians loved beer. They would bury the dead with beer to transition into the afterlife, get there comfortably, beer in your hand. What's going on here? They harnessed opium as a medicine, but also it's believed as a recreational substance. They would harness plants like henbane, which were a kind of psychedelic deliriums. They were a part of ancient Egyptian society. The Greeks too. They loved drugs. The high priestess of Apollo would deliver prophecies that people would come from far and wide to hear, and she would do so after inhaling gases that were being released out of the ground, and then she would predict people's futures. In Egypt, I say in Egypt, an Egyptian mummy was being sort of studied by some archaeologists in 1992, and they found traces of cocaine and nicotine in these mummies. And these samples are quite controversial because they've been studied again and again, and these samples keep showing up. And this is interesting because cocaine and nicotine aren't native to Africa and Europe. They are from the Americas. And there's no real recorded evidence of trade between these two continents at that time, but they had to have come from somewhere. And it's possible that we were trading drugs because they were so prized way before we realise. The other one I really love about ancient Greece is the ceremonies that were going on at the Temple of Eleusis. So these ceremonies went on for 2,000 years, shrouded in secrecy, but they were a real integral part of Greek society. Many famous names from ancient Greece that you would know, like Plato, would attend these ceremonies. People would come from far and wide again to attend them, and they would fast for days, and then they would drink this drink, and they would dance, and they would chant, and they would sing, and enter into these kind of enlightened states. And at the center of this was a drink called koukion. Now, koukion is hotly contested what the actual magic ingredient was. It obviously wasn't recorded because it was quite secretive, but some vases, like vessels that people were drinking at an Eleusinian temple were examined, and they found traces of ergot. Now, if we have any kind of psychedelic pharmacologists in here and people who are interested in psychedelic drugs, you will know that ergot is the fungus that LSD was first synthesized from. So these ancient Greek ceremonies that people were coming far and wide to attend, and that had a real big part of Egyptian culture. And in fact, Greek culture. In fact, they believe that it was the formation of the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, which is obviously quite interesting to talk about in a building like this. But yeah, they were fueled by an LSD-like beverage, it's believed. The Romans loved wine, obviously, integral part of Roman culture, but also cannabis too. A Greek philosopher was staying in Rome, and he wrote in his diary that he would observe the Romans making cakes out of cannabis seeds to create a feeling of warmth and to stimulate an appetite for drinking and eating. So the Romans were bang into edibles. And drugs play a part in religions too. A Jewish shrine that was uncovered and was examined in 2022, they found kind of residues of kind of incenses that were being burnt in the shrine. And one of them contained like frankincense and your obvious religious kind of herbs and what have you. But the other one contained animal dung and cannabis. And we're not just talking wild hemp that might have had a trace amount of THC in it. There was enough THC in this residue to get you high. So cannabis was a part of religious worship for people, 2,700 BC, this shrine. And cannabis kind of pops up in the Bible, believe it or not. In the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, God commands Moses to make a holy oil, an anointing oil. And one of the key ingredients is cannabosum. Now, cannabosum is believed to translate to cannabis. And Moses would use this oil for anointing, but he would also burn it in a similar way to the shrine that was discovered in 2022. And Moses would burn this oil and he'd inhale the smoke in a tent, so he was hotboxing, and he would speak directly to God. I mean, he's just getting stoned and having a chat with God. And this oil pops up elsewhere in the Bible. There's a chap you might have heard of called Jesus. He would famously perform miracles with his magic holy oil. And it's the same oil that Moses used. So Jesus was going around healing the sick with cannabis oil. It's like a CBD influencer way before his time. Religion gives us the introduction to another part of drugs called Prohibition, right? So in the 7th century, we all know that under Islam, under Sharia law, alcohol is outlawed, it's banned. But apart from that, really, around this period of time, drugs are pretty much left alone until attention turns to one of our favourite drugs, caffeine. So caffeine's the most consumed drug in the world. It's legal everywhere, and anyone can consume it, unless you're a Mormon. But yeah, generally speaking, caffeine is consumed all around the world, and we humans love caffeine, right? Our entire existence is fueled by tea and coffee, right? Who doesn't get up and first thing they do make a cup of coffee? And caffeine and coffee, they're a really, really important part of history, because by the 17th century, across Europe, we absolutely love coffee. Coffee houses are springing up everywhere. 3,000 here in England alone, it's believed. And coffee houses around this time are like a meeting point for gentlemen to discuss politics, art, business, gossip. And this becomes a bit of a problem for the ruling class, because it's around the time of the Enlightenment, and King Charles II, he's a little bit concerned. Gentlemen are meeting up, these rigorous discussions, they're talking about changing the future. And he feels like he's threatened by this. So he outlaws coffee houses, he bans coffee houses, because he's worried about this drug fueling enlightenment, and it's a threat to him. And this sets a really important trend. It's the use of prohibition to control people, wealth, and power. And we see this in modern prohibition. So over the kind of past couple of 100 years, the first real modern drug law, as we would know it, was the Pharmacy Act, passed here in England, of 1868. And it was quite sensible, actually. The idea with this act was to stop anyone selling dangerous drugs and poisons like cocaine and opium and stuff like that. Pharmacists have to sell it, because then they can ensure that the quality is pure, that there is advice given when they're dispensing, and obviously that they're dispensing to the right people. And the US doesn't follow far behind with an Opium Act that's passed in 1875, but this one's a little bit different. It's a little bit less about public health. So the Opium Act passed in America at this time. There's two ways people could consume opium. They could consume a tincture with laudanum in, or they could go to an opium den and smoke it. Now, predominantly, white people would consume laudanum, and Chinese immigrants would be smoking opium. And when this act's passed, it only outlaws the smoking of opium. It doesn't outlaw the consumption of it in a tincture. And it's because they wanted to vilify the Chinese immigrants. They were scared that these Chinese immigrants were leading white men and women astray. And we see this happen over and over again throughout history. This kind of racism gets exported back to the UK. So, end of the First World War, opium and cocaine use is rife in the UK. It's especially here in London, in the West End. And he's kind of left alone, kind of swept under the table until the death of a young white actress called Billy Carlton. Now, Billy Carlton was keeping company of gentlemen in the West End, and they were black and Chinese gentlemen. And the media gets hold of this death story. You know, other people have died from overdoses. You know, this tragedy is happening. But they get hold of this story, and they whip the public up into a frenzy. It's the right-wing press, it's the Express, mainly. And they start reporting on this and really delving into her background. And essentially, the story is that this promising young white actress was led astray by these dark gentlemen, these mysterious gentlemen from afar. And that leads to the Dangerous Drugs Act of the 1920s being passed, and it pushes drugs back underground. And again, we start to see a trend of communities being linked with drugs because it plays into a narrative. So much has been written about drug laws in the US, right? The cannabis prohibition of the US. You know, it's probably one of the most hotly debated topics, especially in our circle. And that came about, again, essentially because of racism. So we all know that the US banned alcohol 1920 to 1933, the Prohibition era, right? It was famously an absolute disaster. You know, alcohol, telling people they can't consume alcohol didn't stop people consuming alcohol. It just pushed the production and supply into criminal hands. It reduced the purity. People were, you know, getting ill, dying from contaminants. And it was putting money and power into criminals' hands. So Prohibition ended, you know, it was repealed because it just didn't work. And when this happened, there was a chap called Harry Anslinger. Now, Harry Anslinger was basically in charge of stemming the flow of bootleg alcohol, and he's suddenly faced with not having a job, not having a department. So he's like, right, I need a new vice to pick on. And he thinks about kind of cocaine and opium again. But they're a white man problem. They're a white man drug, and you know, the supply comes from white businessmen. And he needs another drug to focus on, another community to focus on, because he needs to whip up a frenzy. He needs to keep his job. He needs to scare the public and government into being afraid of something. And so he starts to link cannabis, marijuana, with the African-American community who are in America because of the end of slavery, and Mexican immigrants, because there's been a big wave of Mexican immigration at the start of the 1900s. And this is bullshit, because Mexicans weren't really smoking cannabis. But he does it anyway, and he's quite open about his racism. I've got a quote from him here because it's quite staggering just how racist he was. So Anslinger said, "There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US. Most are Negroes, Hispanic, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, results from marijuana use, and their marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with these Negroes, entertainers, and others." And unfortunately, it works. You know, cannabis is illegal in America as a result of it. And this pattern gets picked up because it's successful. Another example is President Nixon. He was up for re-election in the middle of the Vietnamese War, and it wasn't going very well. The war was doing terribly, but also there was protests on the street. So the protests were being fueled by the hippie community and the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement and the hippie community joined forces to protest all across the country. And this is bad for an election campaign, right? You don't want protests on the street. You don't want people on television criticizing you. So he needs to demonize these movements with drugs. And this isn't conjecture. This isn't just me giving you an idea that maybe this happened. It's recorded. A chap called John Ulrichman was one of Nixon's campaign advisors. I've got another quote for you here because this one's just as bad. And Ulrichman said later in life to a journalist, he said, "Do you want to know what the war on drugs was really about? The Nixon campaign and the White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. And we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or the blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt these communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." But it works. Nixon gets re-elected, and it leads to the war on drugs. It's famously the war on drugs. Drugs become public enemy number one, and he unites leaders around the world on his crusade. Because you can fight a war against an invisible enemy, and it's easy. And this leads to the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which basically harmonizes prohibition around the world. But it doesn't just harmonize prohibition, it basically stifles any meaningful debate, it stifles research. Like LSD was, at the time, before it was made illegal, it was being studied for its psychotherapy properties, just much like psychedelics today. And it was the darling of the scientific community. But once it was made illegal, once it was vilified, and drugs were public enemy number one, if you're a scientist, you're a researcher, you can't even mention it, you can't bring it up, you can't say, I want to study this. And it works for 50 years. And it brings us kind of up to the modern day. There's kind of a saying about the war on drugs, that we've been fighting the war on drugs for 50 years, and drugs have won. And we know that prohibition does more harm than good. We've seen it time after time. Alcohol prohibition doesn't make people stop drinking, it just makes things worse for the public. It puts the public at risk. It puts money into the hands of criminals. Humans want to alter their consciousness, we know that. We've got evidence of it for 10,000 years at least. And so we know prohibition doesn't work, but mostly we persist with it. But there has been some seeds of change this century specifically. And I want to give you the example of Portugal. So at the end of the last century, 1999-2000, Portugal had a huge, huge problem with drug consumption. Had between 50,000 and 100,000 heroin users. Had some of the highest drug death rates in the world, and it had the highest in Europe HIV infection rate from people sharing equipment to inject. And so Portugal goes, this isn't working. Let's stop doing this is madness. Let's make drugs a public health issue. Let's stop them being a criminal issue. And it works. So in 2001, drugs are decriminalised and drug death rates drop, HIV infection rates drop. And now Portugal is considered like one of the leaders in the world, and in Europe, it has the lowest drug death rates of all countries in Europe. So Portugal has 6 million drug deaths per million, drug deaths per million adults. The EU is 24 per million. And compare that to the highest. Anyone know the highest drug death rates in Europe? It's in Scotland. It's 315 per million. So when we stop with prohibition, we abandon prohibition as a policy, we see that drug use actually drops, and we saw this in Portugal. And we see it with cannabis. I mean, no more is a drug having a change of perception in the world than cannabis. We've now got 9 legal countries and countless states across the US. Many, many more countries have decriminalised. They've just told the police not to bother. And dozens of countries have now got legal medical cannabis. But yet we're still being told these stories by certain people that if we legalise cannabis, the world's going to come to an end. We're told that crime's going to go through the roof, that teen use is going to increase, and all kind of manner of, things are told. And we have the data now to see that this isn't true. In fact, what we have the data to show from countries like Canada, which have, kind of years behind them, is things like teen use drops. Now, it makes sense to me because there's two things at play, really. First of all, who smoked weed as a rebellious teenager behind the back of the bike sheds or whatever, right? When your dad's smoking weed in the front room and you can buy it from a shop around the corner, it's not rebellious and naughty anymore, so it loses its appeal to teens. But also, when you have got regulated supply where, go in and have to show ID that you're 18 or whatever to buy cannabis, teenagers can't get hold of it anymore. So teen use actually goes down as a result of legalization. We see things like opioid use and deaths go down. Alcohol consumption goes down. I mean, alcohol is great, but it's one of the most dangerous drugs you can consume. Even in America, where states that have legalized cannabis, around these areas where cannabis is legalized, house prices have been going up. So we're told the same old scare stories, and we have the data now to show they aren't true. And we see this with psychedelics as well, right? I mean, again, we were told as kids that if you take one trip, you're going to fry your brain, and that's going to be the end of you. I mean, I'm sure many of you will remember the story of the guy who took acid once and thought he was a glass of orange juice. But now, we see that psychedelics, you can't pick up a newspaper, you can't open the internet without seeing a story about how psilocybin's the revolution in mental health. They're using DMT, they think it might be able to reverse Alzheimer's. Even MDMA, which we were told, take one pill and you're going to drop dead on the dance floor, it's being used to treat PTSD. So, at the moment, our relationship, and that's the nature of this talk, is our relationship with drugs, and it's changing rapidly at the moment. Never has it changed more quickly than it is now in the past kind of few hundred years. And the truth is, it has always been changing, ever since we started harnessing plants to alter our consciousness 10,000 years ago. But it's changing in a good way, and it's changing into a place where we can have grown-up, evidence-backed discussions like the one that we've been having today. Thank you.